So allow me to explain myself here. I am simply an elder resident of the island of Sodor, whose time is almost up. I am here today to pass on a story that has been fading further and further into legend over the past several decades, and I would simply like to tell it to somebody before my time on this earth is up. This story dates back many, many years ago, and it is so outlandish that many people would choose not to believe it, which is perfectly fine. If I had not been around to experience it myself, I doubt that I would believe it as well. But, as one of the few living people who experienced these odd events firsthand, I feel that I need to pass this on to the next generation, for the story is, if nothing else, quite intriguing, and should not be forgotten. This story takes place many years ago, nearly an entire century, actually. It revolves around a small traction engine by the name of Trevor. Trevor worked at the Wellsworth Vicarage Orchard, owned by the Reverend Charles Laxey. Trevor had, by all accounts, a very happy life working there, and he delighted in giving children rides around the orchard every Sunday after the Reverend's church services. I myself remember taking rides on him. Such a pleasant fellow he was, if only he had known. On the morning of October 15th, 1923, Trevor was called to help out at the harbor. He hadn't had much to do in the recent months, and was delighted at the chance to do some work. He left for the harbor around 9 a.m. on a flat truck, pulled by the Northwestern Railway's number 2, Edward. Trevor and Edward were good friends. Edward had saved Trevor from scrap several years before, and it had been Edward who had informed the vicar about the help needed at the harbor to give Trevor a chance to do some work. Ironically, it sort of was Edward's goodwill that got poor Trevor into this mess. About halfway to the harbor, Trevor was given to the NWR's number 1, Thomas, for the remainder of the journey. The harbor was in a terrible mess, and it took a long time to clean and organize everything. At around 8 o'clock p.m., as there was nothing left for Thomas to do, Trevor told Thomas to go ahead home and that he would drive home via road. Thomas, who usually returned to his shed at Farquhar by 9, gratefully agreed. A few hours later, at around 11 o'clock p.m., Trevor left Knapford Harbor for his home at Wellsworth. The harbor would be the last confirmed location of Trevor. Around midnight, the mist began to roll in. Mist was not uncommon on Sodor, with it being an island surrounded by water, but there was something different about this fog. It brought with it a certain feeling of sadness and dread to anyone who happened to be out in it. I should know, as I had been playing outside enjoying the autumn leaves when it rolled in. At the time, I was only 7 years old, but I still remember the immense feeling of dread that I felt with the fog, so much so that I ran into my house crying uncontrollably, and when I reached the safety of my home, my parents had asked me why I was crying, and I told them that I didn't know, which was true. The fog had simply brought that utterly terrible feeling upon me, and it was too much to handle. Another thing that I feel is worth mentioning about this mist is just how quickly it came in. 1 minute it was completely clear, and the next the air was completely full of puffy white fog. It was a thick fog, too. You couldn't see your hands 6 inches from your face, and the trees out of my window seemed to take on strange and scary shapes. Needless to say, it was not a pleasant fog at all. Anyway, at around 12:30, Mrs. Stevens, a nice elderly woman, saw Trevor trundling down Country Route 20. What's odd about this, though, is that Trevor always whistled to Mrs. Stevens, yet when she walked out onto her front porch to wave at him, he didn't whistle back at her. In fact, according to her, Trevor didn't even look up or acknowledge that she was there at all. He just stared blankly into the distance and continued on his way. About a half an hour later, at around 1 a.m., Rob Turner, a signalman who was stationed in a signal box located right next to Country Route 35, saw Trevor trundling on by. Like Mrs. Stevens, Rob waved at Trevor, with no reaction from the little traction engine. Even stranger, Turner claimed that just after Trevor had passed his signal box, he had taken his eyes off him for, quote, only a few seconds. But when Rob looked up, Trevor was nowhere to be seen. Approximately 45 minutes later, at 1:45 a.m., Dr. Albert Blue, a wealthy doctor working at a Sodor hospital, was waiting for the fog to clear in a local pub when he saw Trevor rolling along down country Route 66. Like the other two, Dr. Blue claimed that Trevor had not looked up at all, and he would later say that, quote, he appeared to be in some sort of trance. He just stared blankly off into the distance and continued on down the road. I, as well as the others in that pub, all agreed that there was something definitely off about the little traction engine that night. The next sighting of Trevor happened over an hour later at around 3 a.m. by farmer Arthur Trotter. Trevor had helped out on Farmer Trotter's farm several times before, so Trotter, who was out doing some early morning farm work, instantly recognized him and waved to his old friend, traveling slowly down country Route 48. But just like the other witness accounts, Trevor didn't respond to Trotter. However, unlike the other witness accounts, Trotter claimed that Trevor had looked extremely sad, and he even stated that he had seen tears rolling down his face. He claimed that Trevor had looked at him for a fraction of a second, then snapped right back into his trance and continued on his way. About an hour later, Trevor was spotted for the last time that night, sometime around 4 a.m. by Mr. James Clark, a local school teacher who had to wake up early to catch a bus to work, saw Trevor strolling down country Route 12. Mr. Clark was a very pleasant man, and he leaned out of his window and called out a greeting to Trevor. Just like the other witnesses, though, James claimed that Trevor had not even spared him a passing glance, and that he had just stared blankly forward and continued on his way. Now, to someone who was not familiar with Sodor's geography, these sightings may not sound too off-putting. However, anyone who is familiar with Sodor geography will be quick to realize that the 5 roads that Trevor was spotted on were located in 5 completely different towns in completely opposite directions, each many miles apart. There was no possible way that an engine of Trevor's speed could be in this many places in this amount of time, not to mention that these roads are all miles out of the way of Wellsworth, Trevor's ultimate destination. Trevor never did make it home to the vicarage orchard that night. His driver, Jem Cole, was found the next day in Tidmouth, a town that is yet again several miles from any area where Trevor was supposedly spotted. He was found dazed, disoriented, and unable to speak, laying in a ditch next to the railway line. Whatever had happened that night had broken Jem, and he refused to say a word. All that he did was shake violently every time someone tried to approach him, and hiss and growl at them until they were out of sight. He was admitted to the Vicarstown Asylum, where he took his own life less than a month after being admitted. Rumor has it that his suicide happened on a day when a thick fog rolled in. Anyway, back to Trevor. In the weeks following his disappearance, a search party of over 100 people scoured the entire island looking for any sign of him, but to no avail. The people who had claimed to see Trevor all told their stories to the police. They were all shocked and terrified to learn of the other sightings of Trevor that night. The entire island was both scared and intrigued at the story, and the media wasted no time in spilling the details of the story all over the island. For months, the entire island was buzzing with some of the highest-ranking detectives from all different countries. The people talked of nothing but the little traction engine who disappeared. Mary Marvel, a famous Sudrian poet, even wrote a poem about it, titled Lost in the Fog. Despite all of the thrill and popularity the case sparked, within a year, the story was all but forgotten and life had returned to normal. Reverend Laxey purchased a new traction engine, the Sodor government officially declared the case closed, and the media moved on to more current topics. For a while, I would have sworn that the story would be forgotten forever. But this, as I would come to find, would not be the case. 4 years after the incident, in 1927, a fog just like the first rolled in. I was now 11 years old, and like most people, I had forgotten about Trevor. But then, one November night, that would all change. I remember the day that it rolled in. I was helping my father cut up wood in the shed behind our house. As we worked, suddenly, nearly at the exact same time, we felt it. The same feeling of dread and despair that I had felt years before came rushing back to me in less than a second. I began crying uncontrollably, and I remember my father, fighting for all that he was worth to hold in tears, picking me up and running as fast as he could back to the safety of our house. Once inside, we shut the door and all the windows tightly, and my father grabbed me my favorite book to comfort me. Later that night, at around 9 p.m., Officer William Croven sat in his office at the local police station when he heard the telephone ring. He walked over to the telephone and answered it. He heard the shaky and scared voice of a young woman who claimed to have seen Trevor the traction engine rolling down Country Route 25. She said that she had seen him staring blankly off into the distance, shuffling along down the road without a driver. She said that she remembered hearing about the disappearance of the little traction engine years earlier, but had never believed it. The woman gave Officer Croven her address, but never her name. He rode his police bike to her house as fast as he could, but by the time he arrived at the house, it was too late, for the woman had taken her own life. Croven would later describe the scene as, quote, brutal, blood everywhere. The woman had stabbed herself so many times that the body was barely recognizable. This woman would not be the only one to see Trevor that night. Over the next 8 hours, 6 more people would report sightings of Trevor in 6 completely different locations. Of the witnesses, 3 out of 7, including the woman, committed suicide after reporting their sightings to the police. The other 4 would all go to weekly therapy sessions for several years after the encounters. The witnesses claimed that the sheer amount of terror from the little engine was enough to drive them mad. One stated that, quote, the feeling of dread that comes from the fog feels about 10 times worse when that traction engine is around. It just takes the will to live right out of you. And just like that, the entire country was reminded overnight of the events from 4 years earlier. The media was once again booming with news from the sightings. Tourists, intrigued, came from all over the world with cameras in an attempt to catch Trevor on camera. Leading supernatural investigators said that it was, quote, unlike anything that they had ever seen before. From then on, for years afterwards, a fog like that would roll in periodically, and every time it did, many people would claim to see Trevor. Over half of the people who reported sightings took their lives within a week. One person, Mr. Aaron Hughes, managed to snap a photo of the traction engine. Hughes claimed that as soon as he had snapped the photo, the traction engine had, quote, vanished into thin air, taking the immense feelings of suicide with him. He said that while he was still quite shaken up, that he had felt no thoughts of suicide, and that he simply had reported his sightings to the police and went on with his life. That photograph that Mr. Hughes took became the cover page of too many newspapers to count. Experts scrutinized the photo for hours, and ultimately came to the conclusion that it was 100% real. Reverend Laxey himself even stated that he was completely confident in saying that it was Trevor. And yet, many people, including myself, were skeptical. I had personally experienced the fog and knew the effects that it brought with it, but I just couldn't bring myself to believe that there was actually a lost engine who came with the fog. That was until I saw Trevor. I remember the night that it happened. I was in my late 20s and I had gone to visit my grandmother for the day. I had only planned on staying until dark. However, that all changed when the mist came down. It was the same mist that I had felt before. However, as I was never out in it this particular time, the feeling of dread did not come over me. I knew that it was too thick to drive through, so after talking with my grandmother, I decided to stay at her house that night. Her home was located right on Country Route 31. At around midnight, my grandmother had already gone off to bed, and I was listening to the radio for a few more minutes before I would be heading off to join her. At one point, I happened to notice movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked out the window and nearly died of shock. I blinked several times. I tried to tell myself that I was wrong, but I knew what I was looking at. It was someone that I hadn't seen for years. It was Trevor. I knew that it was. I had ridden on him many times as a child, and I instantly recognized him. As I stared in awe at the little traction engine chuffing aimlessly down the road, staring blankly at absolutely nothing, I began to sob. Mr. Hughes had been right. The sight of Trevor was pulling the will to live right out of me. I cried hysterically, and I didn't stop even when Trevor had disappeared into the fog. My loud weeping awoke my grandmother from her slumber, and she asked me what was wrong. I told her that I had seen Trevor. Without asking any questions, she hugged me and told me that I was all right. She then proceeded to make me a warm cup of tea and talked comfortingly to me. Eventually, I began to feel a little bit better and was even able to fall asleep. To this day, I firmly believe that had my grandmother not been there, that I would have ended my life right then and there, and that I would have been another one of Trevor's victims. Despite my grandmother's comforting, I still had to receive weekly therapy for nearly a decade, and I refused to stay the night by myself anywhere. I moved back in with my parents, and they seemed to understand my predicament. Eventually, I was able to move past the incident, and I moved on with my life and away from my parents. From time to time, though, I would have a horrible nightmare that would take me back to that night, but it was never enough to impact me for more than a day. As for Trevor, the mist would continue to roll in for several years, each time bringing Trevor with it. Eventually, however, the odd fog stopped appearing, and while the island still does receive fog quite often, Trevor has not been seen for over half a century, and the story has basically faded into legend. To this day, I still have no idea what happened that one fateful November night. Whether or not it was nothing more than people letting their imaginations run wild, or if Trevor really was there for years after his disappearance, will most likely forever remain a mystery. Nevertheless, the story of the little traction engine who got lost in the fog will forever remain just as intriguing as it is disturbing.